Hi, everyone. Welcome to another D5 webinar. I appreciate you all taking the time to join us, especially on this Saturday afternoon. My name is Jeff Espinoza, sales engineer here at D5 Render, and I'm excited to be here with you. I'm excited to be here with you all. And here I have our hosts, Kamar Thomas and Francis Kwok from Novaforma Studios. Today, Kamar and Francis will walk us through their process for creating ultra-realistic interior renderings in D5 Render. With a special focus on a kitchen scene. After their presentation, we'll have a Q&A session where you can dive deeper into their workflow and get their questions answered. Also, be sure to stick around until the end for a 14-day trial of D5 Render Pro so you can explore all the techniques and workflows showcased here today. And so with that, I'll hand things over to Francis. Francis, take it away.
Hi, so I'm Francis. So we started off with our firm, which is basically Kamar and me, which we two got to know each other in graduate school of architecture, masters. And from there, we sort of had a shared vision, which helped us through channeling creativity and architectural visualization. So we created this company called Novaforma Studios. From there, we started to expand a lot of our projects because our creativity are always there and connected, and we're always together in terms of workflows. So our projects range from schematic design into architectural visualization, and we mostly do residential, hospitality, commercial. We even do automotive. So our ranges are really high. So we're going to start off by doing modeling setups in Rhino, which is similar to SketchUp. And then we're going to jump into D5 Render. So I'm going to start off with the live demo of the Rhino model. So we always start off with early communications, which is basically is existing house somewhere in the States, and the client wants us to do a modeling as well as rendering based on existing renovations that they're working on. We're currently showcasing the kitchen, but there are other spaces that we did model and render for. Usually in the early communications, we usually get more information in terms of schedules. Schedules meaning plumbing fixtures to lighting fixtures to finishes. All those will be a great factor into creating a correct model, which will eventually help us in terms of creating the depth we need for the renderings. So it also helps us to understand the mood and the feel of what the client is trying to aim for. So the first off, we have to organize a lot of these details into the correct layers. So you can see here with all the different types of colors means that they're all in different layers. Usually, if you understand the finishes that are required for it, you could easily put in the modeling into the correct layer. For example, we separate the upper cabinets with the lower cabinets, mainly just because usually, depending on where you're working, you have a different finish on the top portion versus the bottom portion. So we put it in separate layers. It'll be easier to organize later when we get into D5. So if you see on the right, we usually have a typical template that showcases, for example, modeling. And then within there, we showcase the exterior versus the interior. Exterior meaning facades, windows, exterior doors, and then separating them by glass to mullions to facades in general. Basically, every surface that requires a different finish usually is preferred to be in a separate layer. So by doing that, for example, in Rhino, we're putting it in a separate layer. But if you're working in SketchUp, it will be a color format. So you just change the color to the specified that you need, and that will showcase the layer for D5. So in here, we showcase the material to separate to a different color. And all those colors will basically separate the model in D5. Um, by, like I said earlier, by getting more into entourage elements, like understanding what plumbing fixtures or appliances that we have, we could separate the models in here in Rhino versus D5. Usually, typically, if the file is heavy, for example, let's just say if you guys spec'd out a range and is usually heavy, we usually just put it into D5 rather than putting it into Rhino model, which will load the file to be really heavy. Later on, when you pan around or doing the live sync into D5, it's just a little chaotic to pan around. So one way of doing it is, for example, sometimes we have the kitchen sink. We do need it sometimes because it gets really heavy and customizable, that we have it in D5, but we do need to import it into Rhino to create the opening of it, because you can't really do that in D5 in a way, especially when it comes to customization. So we usually put it in here. We get the correct dimensions according to the spec that you specify, so that we create the openings and put certain materials in here, so that later on when you get into D5, you could put the actual sink in the correct location with the openings already. Um, the main idea of the modeling side versus the D5 is modeling every aspect of gaps. So show you here, for example, when you go into information that you don't really receive from interior designers, or interior designers to showcase the lines, but doesn't showcase the details. So in for this project, the client only specified line weights in terms of, like, for example, a 1/4 inch or a 3/4 inch, but we didn't have much detail. So I based this off of a reference image, which showcases like a sort of a border detail. So I added that in, and then showcase it to the interior designer in this case, or sometimes it's a client in general, and see what they like or what they want to change. So by doing that, you could get the depth and the feel of it, and later on when you do the modeling, it sort of creates that joint line, the shadow lines that is needed to create a realistic rendering. But there's things that obviously you don't have to model. For example, the gap between the panel versus the surrounding areas. As you can see here, I sort of created the 1/8 gap, which is typical in realistic life. Um, but in some cases, some people don't have to model it. But when you do the rendering, you won't have that darkness that sort of wraps around pantry, I mean the cabinetry door. So the best way is sort of to create that gap that's needed. Every gap and every detail will basically showcase what will come realistic in the renderings because of all the amount of details. For example, um, we wanted a window trim, but the client didn't know what they wanted. They just specified a website and what needs they want, if it's like 1/2 inch or 1/4 inch creating detail. And then we looked at that website and we specified which one is best needed for this project, which works well with the other trims that was asked for in this project. By adding more of those details, you could fine line more depth, and the line will later showcase in the shadows. So when you do the modelings, obviously there is technically you could hide the certain elements, and you could unhide some of the elements. But the problem with that is that no matter what happens when you import it into D5, wherever you have hidden or non-hidden, it will always show up. So the best way is to either delete it or move it into a separate file in case you need it later. Um, because no matter what, it always pinpoints to the same coordinates. so that you could easily put it back in. So this portion is mainly, this is just for the rendering side, modeling side of things. So I'm going to give it to Kmart, which will join into the rendering side of it.
Hey everyone. Like what Francis had mentioned, I'll talk or cover most of like the rendering side of it. So I'll start from talking about the rendering settings, the material setups, and lighting setup, and then towards the end, which is the preset and the final results. And I'll show you how to get from the start to the finish when you get your scene into D5. So to start off, you have your scene in either SketchUp or Rhino. You do the live sync, or you just import it into D5. Either one is fine, and your model lands somewhere in D5 space. Once that happens, I recommend locking your model, like how I have it here. We usually lock the file, um, because it's working off of coordinates. So like what Francis had mentioned before, if you have any heavier model elements that you want to link in, like the stove and things like that, as long as you model it in the same place, whether in SketchUp or Rhino, and you put in another SketchUp or Rhino file, you could import it into D5. And because a coordinate-based logic, it should snap directly back into the same place. That's how you modeled it. Um, so once doing that, uh, you have your model in D5. The first thing that I recommend doing is setting up the camera first. So to do that, I would typically just initially when you bring your model in, it comes in as this by default with the layers that you assigned it in SketchUp or Rhino. I recommend changing the display to clay mode for now, uh, and kind of try to figure out where you want your cameras to be. So before you get into a lot of lighting, before you get into the material, try to understand where the camera is situated first. And this goes a long way because you don't want to add lighting or add materials to places that's not being captured in the overall rendering output. So as you can see, I put, you know, I set up a camera here, and to go through the camera situation, so you you put your camera in, you pan around to exactly how you think you want to get it. The first thing we would do is adjust the aspect ratio. Typically, we do a one-to-one. I preferably like one-to-one ratio, just because everything is somewhat proportion in terms of what you see up top to the bottom to left and right, and you kind of get like this focal point that I really like. So we typically do one-to-one, and then we set a field of view in respect to that. Um, so I'll cover over the different range of field of views that we use. Typically, we use a field of view range right here between 45 to 70 degrees, and I'll show you why we go from that range. So if we did a 16 by 9 ratio, um, you know, we typically would do a higher field of view, which is typically like 70. And this looks good for that field of view. The reason why we stop it at 70 is because the more you go, the more things look distorted from an angle, and it starts to create that unrealistic effect. So we usually keep it around 70 at max for 16 by 9, and as we go towards a one-to-one, we land somewhere between either 50 or 45. Um, and obviously, the lower the field of view, the closer zoomed in your camera will be. But if you're looking for like that realistic field of view, one-to-one, we usually keep it around 45 to 50. 16 by 9, we usually keep it higher, around the 70 to 60 field of view. If you're doing portrait, um, sometimes we use this when we want to post on Instagrams and things like that, or social media. We even go like lesser sometimes, and you know or around 45 exactly, and then we just zoom in or move the camera up further to get that. So that's kind of like the workflow logic there from field of view. So going back, we keep aspect ratio 1-to-1, field of view of 45 for this camera angle. Um, So in our scene, we had two camera angles that we wanted to explore. So we had this one, and then the second camera angle, which is here. And in a 2-point perspective like this, so in this case, in this one, this will be a 1-point perspective as it's just one focal. In this perspective, this will be more of a 2-point perspective. In this, we adjusted the field of view instead of 45 to be 50 because we wanted to capture a little bit more of that cabinetry. And this is kind of getting towards capturing the most while maintaining a realistic eye. Um, One thing we also use is if you go to display and you turn on grids, this is super helpful because as you can see, we use the grids to make sure our verticals stay vertical. So if you look at this grid line here, we try to match it so that it's straight onto that edge of the cabinetry right there on the island and things as such. And this kind of helps you make sure that you're looking straight and you're not, instead of looking up or two down or two right, two left. And it kind of helps you center it. This is a really strong tool in D5 and a nice setup workflow that we use. So once you establish your cameras, the next thing I would say is to move on to material. So, for lack of time, I created a different scene that highlights the material. So so when you create your material, you now change your display from clay mode now to the regular to default mode that kind of displays the material. In this case, I would recommend doing a general pass of materials. So this is kind of getting your the general material in. And this is just a general pass because later on we will come back and edit it a bit more. But you just want to get a pass and gets the floor in, gets the wall in. In this case, we used a wallpaper for the walls. For the floor, we use wood, which is very typical in residential. To kind of give you a rundown of how the material logic work, if you click on the material, you go to base map, you have these I guess nodes where you could input like different maps. And the idea is, color material map will go, up top here. Then you have your normal map, your specular map, which is for gloss, this kind of gloss look, roughness, which is, sometimes typical depending on the type of wood floor, if it's vinyl or it's the actual wood and things of such. And usually when you get these materials from, websites and such. So for example, this is an example of one of the material that we got from our website. And there's many websites that kind of has these kind of materials where they just not give you the material itself, but they give you these other mapping. And it's just inputting them in the correct place. And this is just a general pass. Afterwards, you'll have to adjust the sliders, but we could get more into that when we get into a later portion of it. And yeah, so you get your material in, you scale it, nicely. Sometimes you have to use triplanar depending on how you model, but for most cases, you don't really have this issue. We have to toggle this, but it doesn't. It just helps you in the scaling aspect of it. One thing I would recommend sometimes is turning on the reflection caustic, but we could get to that at a later in the presentation. So you get your material. One thing I want to highlight is in this phase when you start adding your pass of materials, you do this before the lighting. You do this before the lighting and setup, and this is without adding any preset or effect. Everything is still on default in D5. So the auto exposure is on and everything. You just do a general pass of material. You also add in your entourage elements as well. And the way how we did it is we did it per layer. So we created our own layer system in D5 and add our entourage in it. So, and then also the vegetation aspect. With this client, let me bring it up. And with this client, we set up this the rendering based on reference image. Let me bring that up. So like every rendering before you start, we look at an inspiration image that we had selected, and this is kind of like the mood and aesthetic that we want. And this is something that needs to be, I guess, discussed with the client prior and understanding what type of look you're going for, even after they give you the material. And this kind of also helps you understand the material and lighting aspect as well as we go forward. And in addition to that, because this was an existing house, we wanted photos of the outside because as you can see, when you start doing the material and setting up the entourage, the background matters a lot in your scenes. And so we wanted to make it look realistic as possible, right? So we got a photo of the exterior condition of the backyard space, and our focus point was this back here where the kitchen is now. This is before the renovation, but we just want to understand the vegetation scene around the house itself and kind of almost mimic it behind the scenes. So to kind of show you that a little bit, this is typically how we've done it. So we put the grass down, and I think this is D5, yeah, default grass. And one would argue that we won't see the grass as much, but you kind of do see it in some of these scenes. You put down the trees using D5 trees. It could be high poly or low poly at this point, just because it's in the background. So this is just helping set up the background scene. And then one thing that's really important is setting up the actual background. Now, some people would add a bunch of trees with poly tree, or you could just add a simple like background. Usually, so for example, we added or imported this background in, and it's really just an image, but we just put it as a background, and this kind of helps create that depth, as you can see. So once you do your general passive material, you put them and your entourage elements, things like like planters, plates. These I would not recommend adding in SketchUp or Rhino into the overall model. These I would just bring in separately, just because too much of these sometimes could bug down the model on the Rhino on the SketchUp side. So we just import these in or use D5 ready ones, which D5 has a nice catalog of these. And for example, we brought in this chair that's from another Rhino file where we created a separate chair. And we bring that in, set up the materials, and then the next thing to kind of focus on, let me bring up my notes. The next thing to focus on is the light. So to get to the light now, so once you have your material set up, you have your camera set up, then generally in a good spot, turn off the auto exposure now, because now we want to focus on the light. And to focus on the light, we need to see first the true light in the scene. So turn off auto exposure and turn off any exposure number, and you kind of want to default it to 0, because now we're trying to understand what light is needed in our scene. There are times where you do need exposure, but this is something I recommend adjusting at the very end as opposed to in the process of setting up your initial lights. So keep this, we keep this in, keep it 0, turn off auto exposure, and then you start to end up with these lights naturally, which is just the sunlight beaming in. The general rule for light that we use is a 60-30-10. So 60, so in a daytime rendering where the sun is outside, you want 60% of your light in your overall render composition to be from outside. And then you only want about 30% of your light, which is coming from like the ceiling lights, to only be 30% of the overall composition. And then 10% of the light would be accent lighting, which is, like under the counters or just like detail lights, very small, delicate lights. So the first thing we'll do is set up the primary lights. So we put the primary lights, which I like to call it exterior lights, in its own layer, and we call it exterior lights. So we first turn that on, and to kind of show you how we do exterior lights. So exterior lights is broken down into 2, right? We have the sunlight, which is from the scene, which is the geo and sky or the HDR, and then we also have these lights that we create to help that as well. For interior renderings with windows, I recommend setting up these type of lights, which is basically rectangle lights that we put at each opening or door with a glass where light is coming in. And I like to consider this as like the natural ambient natural light. It's not meant to be a beam of light, it's more meant to be an atmospheric light. So you set this up. In ours, we kind of set all of them up in the correct spot and then we group them. The reason why we group them is so when you select the group, you could just adjust the light at one go, right? You could change the intensity to 50, 37 or so. For us, we did 37 as a first, as a base, knowing that we'll have to come back and adjust it. So we did 37. We kind of kept most of these by default. This radius, we want to max it out, right? Because this is atmosphere light that's coming in, so it kind of has no, I guess, no boundaries in that sense. So we kind of want to, and that's what this radius does. It kind of keeps everything within that sphere. So we kind of want to max this out so it gets the fullest. Every so often we adjust the temperature, but most of the time we keep it very neutral, around 7,000, depending on how cold or warm you want the scene. But this is supposed to mimic that atmosphere light. If you want, you could turn on caustic, which kind of give you a more realistic reflection throughout when you do the rendering. But sometimes we turn it on, sometimes we don't. It depends on, because sometimes it's kind of cause a little bit of too much brightness in our scene sometimes. But it's something to play around with. So once you set up that lighting, if I go back, turn this on. So I just turned on our exterior light and immediately you can see the difference. Then the next thing we want to do is turn on or create the ceiling light, which is our 30% light. So here we have it already set up. So we turn that on. We use D5 has good ceiling lights that comes with its own light, but we took that and then grouped the lights within it. Right, so we have about 11 and we put this at 10% for each. Now 10% for each or 10 for intensity for each is a good amount because you do 10 times 11 and we had 110 intensity for the overall ceiling lights coming down. We usually do that spotlight, kind of mimicking the way how these lights would typically work. And for this, you can max out the radius. You can max out the radius for this as well because you just want to get the overall light in the space. So we have our 70% or the 37% here for intensity for each one, and then we have the 10% up here. And these could differ. Now, if you were to do the opposite and made the interior lights higher than the outside lights, you start to get a nighttime even scene. And this is how you can achieve different types of rendering scenes, mimicking certain times of the day. So once we have that light in, we do it the same. And if we don't have any accent light in this rendering scene, but we did, it'll kind of show under here and these things, which would be like under cabinet lights and things like that. So that's the general light. Now, the sunlight, we only use it to necessarily create shadows or these dramatic moments. We don't really use it to basically light up the interior. It's really just used to create these kind of realistic shadows and shades, almost like a beam of light. And I'll show you later on when we get into the preset effects portion of how this works even at a greater capacity. So just to kind of go to this next scene to kind of show you the lighting. So we turn on these lights and things starts to look good. At this point, you could go back and edit your material because now with the lights on, you might want to adjust the specular and the metallic of some of these materials as now light is reflecting off of it. So they might be too shiny or too dull. Now, once you set up your light, so now you have your light set up, the material pass, and you've done a pass at the lighting. So now we reach the preset portion. So once that's done, now we start to get into the effects of actually getting out the full on rendering output. So I know sometimes that going through these effects can seem very daunting, but what D5 does a really good job at is already creating presets for you. and you could also create your presets from it. So our company, we create our own presets using D5 preset as a base and created our own. And this is something that you'll build over time. Once you do more renderings and renderings, you kind of could use your own scene as a preset to do future renderings. For this purpose, I'll use a D5 scene and kind of show how we would go through it. So looking through D5 scenes, we could look for interior day one. Let's say we choose this one, the interior day effect. You click it, and then it applies that effect to the scene, right? And immediately you kind of get to see the effect. So it adjusted and added its own contrast, highlight. And this is where once you add it, you could go back and start to adjust your lights, your exterior lights maybe, or your interior lights if it's too bright. Now, once you have this set up, you notice that they're using their own, this effect has its own sun that we mentioned. So you can either rotate it. Again, we're only using the sun to create these effects, but not to necessarily light the scene, right? We just kind of want these plays of shadows. Keep in mind that in our model, we also have like openings behind. So it's very good on the modeling side to kind of model around the space as well, even though you're not rendering. So like we had this opening here because we know that there might be some light coming in. So you could rotate it, to get that look that you want. Sometimes you don't have much control because the HDRI keeps the sun in the same elevation and just rotates it. But sometimes you want to control the elevation, which is fine, the elevation of it. So you could also go to Geosky and kind of have more effect and even adjust the latitude, longitude, and so forth. Personally, I think either one is fine in an interior render. In exterior rendering, I do recommend using a HDRI map, which we could cover at a later part. But for this bit, we'll just keep the HDRI map in. So yeah, keep this in, and then we could adjust something. So we notice that we're having some blinds, some washout spots. Be mindful when you do lights to not have these little washout spots. To achieve them, you might either want to lower the intensity. There could be multiple things: lowering the intensity, the sunlight, also, adjusting the highlight and shadow local exposure helps a lot too in these. And this kind of helps with these kind of washouts, but try to avoid these kind of washout moments from the lighting. So once you have your lighting set up, one thing I also want to cover in this as well is if you use a preset, be cautious of the white balance, especially in white interior rendering. So if you know that the ceiling is white, try to adjust the balance so that white is truly shown as white. If you did it like this, then it starts to look creamish, and then if this white looks creamish, then it kind of throws off the entire rendering as well. So I would adjust this with caution a little bit to make sure that this is true white. Sometimes you do want to get that little warm tint because you don't want the rendering to look sterile or too white. In that case, I would go back to these type of lightings, the exterior light, and adjust the temperature accordingly. That way it kind of creates more of a warmth light coming in and an overall composition as opposed to adjusting the white balance too much. It's also you can also affect the sun temperature and the color temperature as well to kind of get that warm look, depending on the scene you're going for. Another thing I want to cover as well is after you add your presets in, you could also use the vignette. I like this tool a lot because it kind of creates this dramatic moment with the darkened edge. And this kind of really helps towards getting that realistic effect. Another one that we've used recently is kind of use the ambient occlusion radius. So from what I understand, this kind of helps create more contrast in the scenes between your dark and light spots. So if you turn it on and max it out, for example, it starts to show where there's lighting versus the extreme lights, the extreme darks, and kind of having this, if you max it out and then you overlaid it, right, and you turn on and then you turn off, you could kind of see these areas and these edges starting to get a little bit more dramatic in the shade and shadow. And this is something that we use quite a bit throughout. And you could even turn it up and turn it down, but we usually keep it around 2 to kind of give it a little bit more depth to our scene. So yeah, so once you set up the presets, this is how it looked on the other end as well. So going back, set up the presets and click it. You add the presets and then you adjust the effects accordingly and adjust material. And this is where you'll go back to adjusting the material. You go back and adjust lighting if need to, and in the overall sun if you need to rotate it around. But even at this stage, it starts to get into this realistic, natural rendering that we're aimed towards getting. So once you have that, you're at the end where you're ready to like render out. So once we using the preset and modifying it, I think we went and used the sky to do our lighting instead of the HDRI just for this case. So once you have that, you're ready to do the final output, right? So you have both of your kitchen and you have both your kitchen scenes ready set up. You click the camera, as most of you are probably aware of. You click the camera, and then as we said before, your camera setup is good, the ratio is good. We usually do 2K, and then you add it to the render queue. Now, because we did all the effects in D5, we typically don't use Photoshop. We used to use Photoshop, right? And typically you can use Photoshop by exporting the channels, material, and do further post-production work in Photoshop. Lately, we stopped using it just because of D5 AI beta that they're testing, which we found to be way more effective than using a post-production aspect of it in Photoshop. And I'll show you how we use it and how to account for certain things as well. So once you render it out, it processes through the render queue, you render it out, you have these 2 renderings, right? After you render it out, you see it on the history, then we click the AI post-processing part. So, and going through the AI post-processing part, we click this, the preview. We normally click the AI enhancer. Typically, we click the enhancement rate. We keep the enhancement rate at 0.7. This is something we test throughout the rendering. So sometimes we might max it out at 1. Sometimes we do 0.7. The issue with 0.1, sometimes it overtly does too much on some things. So we found that 0.7 generally keeps us in an okay spot for the AI to do its thing to kind of enhance the photo or the visual. You can use enhanced content. We typically don't. Reason why is because, and I'll show you, we typically just do an overall version where the AI touches everything, right? So we do the AI enhancement and we do it to both scenes. And let's say we process that forward. So to the left, this is the old scene, right? This is the without AI. And then to the right is with the AI process. And you could tell by how the AI kind of redoes the walls a little bit versus how the walls were back then and the floor. Now, sometimes the AI does things that that it does too much where it kind of messes up the image slightly. So typically what we would do is we would do the plain version like how we have it here, the one with the AI version, and then we would mask it in Photoshop, right? Put the AI version over the original in Photoshop, and just kind of mask out the portion that the AI touched that we didn't want to touch, and that kind of gives us more control over it. But it's rare that we ever had a situation to do that. For this project, we didn't need to do that at all. It kind of rendered out perfectly. So kind of giving you the left and right. The left is the original, the right is the AI perspective one. The left, again, the original, the right is the AI enhancement to it. And from there, we kind of get that ultra realistic look that we were going for. Also, to mention what Francis had mentioned before, the details, the AI does account for that detail that he was mentioning with the shadow lines, as you can see these kind of dark double lines, and that kind of adds to the realism um, that he was mentioning before. It does, D5 does capture it in the original without the AI, but it seems the AI notice it and either further and further enhances it as well. Um, and that kind of talks more to the detail aspect that reference was Francis was mentioning. So yeah, this is the final output of it. Um, yeah, uh, going so and saying so. We covered the rendering settings, the material setup, the lighting setup. Um, so to kind of wrap up in final remarks. So in our final remarks, one thing that was really crucial was the client communication. Like what I mentioned before, getting this inspiration image and kind of creating that tone between the client and us as Novaforma Studio, and understanding what's the mood and aesthetics that needs to be shown, and what's the expectation is really crucial to understand the workflow that needs to happen and what we should try to achieve for. And as Francis was mentioning, for the model accuracy, detail does matter a lot. Um, and to create detail, you kind of first have to organize the model in a way that creating these details isn't overbearing or difficult. As he mentioned with setting up the layers, and this is both in Rhino and SketchUp. I think actually in SketchUp you could use plugins to actually get some of these details for some of these joineries and further detail, which is really amazing. And then also you have the rendering aspect, which kind of speaks towards the realism, which the first thing is always setting up the camera to have a realistic eye and field of view. Um, Being cautious of the textures you're using, kind of adding those little maps, that the normal map, the ambient occlusion, the reflection, the bump map, those help create more realistic looks for sure. Um, and it gets really noticed when you start adding in the lighting aspect. And the lighting is really the key, I feel like, to any good rendering as well. If your lighting is off, then everything starts to look a little bit off. So kind of remembering that 60-30-10 rule is really efficient. And then, the end, which is, I think, is a pretty fun part, is the entourage buildup of adding, like, to kind of create that story of the plates, the food, um, and kind of adding those entourage elements to kind of make the rendering feel more holistic and realistic as well. So yeah, I thank you for everyone that attended, and I'm pretty sure there's many questions out there. Uh, here's our website and our contact and our Instagram information. Please like and follow. And yeah, do you guys have any questions that we can answer?
Great. Thank you, Francis and Kmar. That was really informative. Yeah, as Kmar said, if there are any questions, please feel free to drop them in the comments, and then we'll be happy to answer them. I did have some questions as you were presenting, Kmar.
Yep.
So I know earlier on you were talking about the camera setup, and you were talking about the field of view and all these other settings that you messed around with.
Yep.
And so my question to you is, do you have a preference when it comes to 2-point perspective or just regular perspective camera?
Yes. Yeah, I think for 2-point perspective, and I could show it to you. In 2-point perspective, I found that with 2-point, you're kind of looking more horizontally.
Mhm.
So for that, you kind of want to get a more wider field of view that kind of captures that 2-point perspective feel, as opposed to like a close up, like as such. So
Mhm.
for 2-point perspective, I tend to go to a higher field of view for sure. And then 1-point perspective tends to kind of feels more focused, where you could kind of get more of a lower field of view, which is more towards the 45-35 range.
Okay, yeah, and just to piggyback off that, Svetlana asked if is there a way to achieve a more realistic field of view if you have a small room?
Yes. So, for example, we had a small room that was a pantry, um,
Hmm.
and this room is super small, and this kind of mimics how like pantry rooms or even bathrooms work. Typically, what we would do is we would set up the field of view either way. The issue is that sometimes you'll run into a wall, and this is where we start to use the camera clipping plane, and you'll start to back up the camera. So instead of changing the field of view to fit in the room, we'll just back the camera up, keeping that field of view, and just adjust the clipping plane as needed. So for example, this was another space that we did. So this is how we did the space. We kept the field of view very close up and just used the clipping plane to clip out the walls and
Oh yeah, that's a good tip.
just kind of creates that realistic eye while being in a confined small space.
Right, exactly. Because if you were to increase the field of view, then it would just look
Yeah,
distorted and unnatural. Yeah, that's a good point.
yeah. If we, yeah, to kind of show if we kept it in space without the camera angle and we change the field of view, it starts to get significantly distorted. And you can see it at the walls.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Nice. Yeah, that's a good tip. And then we have another question about Z depth. So is that something that you usually play around, or I guess getting that autofocus look? Is that something you play around with in D5 or take into post production?
Z depth. I rarely use Z depth.
Hmm.
I'm not opposed to it. It's just we just never really had a chance to utilize it efficiently.
Hmm.
To kind of create that depth, we usually just simply just create a depth of field. Um, and yeah, we usually create a depth of field. And if we still need more depth, then we get into like adding like fog elements and things as such, and then probably would
Mm.
take that into Photoshop at that point. That way we could have a little bit more control on how to turn it on and off certain aspects of it.
Okay, nice. And maybe this is a question for Francis, but Pablo asked, how can you easily add those joints and cabinetry on Rhino?
So in Rhino, you typically have a line. By utilizing a line in terms of details, whether you receive it from an interior designer or you're the one who's doing it, by creating a line, you could do a sweep tool, which basically you sweep and creates that detail that wraps around a certain around a corner, whether it's in the pantry, so on a cabinet, or if you want to do a base or top molding. As long as you have that line, you can sweep it through a specific corner, and that basically dictates your line weight.
Nice. Thanks for those tips, Francis. And yeah, I would add that also, another great thing about D5 is that you can do that AO overlay. So if you have like those really fine details, you can always turn that on and get even more control of like the shadows.
Yeah. Yeah, the AO, and also the outline mode too, if you ever wanted
Hmm.
to explore that as well. Yeah, kind of helps create that definition.
Nice. Um, and then, yeah, so my other question was, you were talking earlier on about model hygiene, keeping some of the geometry away from Rhino and only in D5 if it's just like a visual element. So I guess my question to you would be, did you find that your Rhino files became too heavy due to all the visualization elements you had to include in the past? And how has that workflow impacted you ever since moving on to D5?
So I can answer that. So
Hmm.
there is some models that we're receiving depending on the spec that the interior designer asked for in terms of like the range or the refrigerator, which we
Hmm.
extract from a third party. Technically, a lot of those files are really heavy. So we usually bring it into Rhino only to measure out the countertop and the cabinetry to make sure that they all align to the specific size needed. But
Hmm.
in general, we don't leave the file. We don't leave the cabinetry of like the appliance in there. It's just because it does get heavy, and when you pan around, it does lag. So if you're doing a live sync and you're trying to get the exact location in terms of camera for the view of vision where you want it, the more heavier the Rhino file, the more lag you're gonna get while you're running Rhino and D5 in there. By putting it into D5, it's a lot lighter on both files in general.
Yeah. And yeah, I guess to add on to what Francis had mentioned, yeah, I think initially our files were just getting too heavy. Like times where our Rhino file was like a gigabyte. So we had to create a solution that didn't have or didn't host every element inside one Rhino file, and that's kind of how we solved it through D5 in that way.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a good point. And yeah, I also see a lot of questions about D5 Render 2.10. And so for that, guys, I would just say stick around till we drop that. Unfortunately, can't do any sneak peeks today, but yes, stay tuned for that. Really excited for the 2.10 drop. So another question I had was about the wallpaper material that you were showcasing earlier.
Yeah.
Is that a material? Is that a material that you found on the asset library, or is that a custom material that you developed yourself? And what was
So
that process like?
uh so this material, I guess this will be a good chance to kind of show. So this material, the designers kind of spec'd out this material for us to use. So
Hmm.
we went on the manufacturer website and they just only had an image of this material, right? So it's a very specific material. The way how we pulled it is, we basically pulled in the PNG or the JPEG from the manufacturer website and put it into D5 as is, right? Which could create a lot of issues sometimes because sometimes it's not seamless, and you also don't get this other map information. However, luckily, D5 has things like texture enhancement. So once we pull that material in, we could kind of make it seamless. We could make it a HD texture from D5, and then we could also add these AI generated texture map from that one material, which we
Hmm.
did in this case. So all this map information is actually coming from D5 AI, and the ultra a high definition of it is also coming from D5 process of just making it work and seamless as well.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, those are great tips. And I think we have time for maybe one more question. Guys, if there are any final questions, please let me know, and I'll be happy to ask away. Let's see here. I guess maybe one last question I had for you guys would be,
Hmm.
very general question again. How has incorporating D5 into your workflow, or what would you say has been the greatest benefit of incorporating D5 into your workflow? Has it been like the rendering speeds, the ease of use, or something else I can't think of right now?
Francis, you want to go first?
Uh, for me, I think it's the ease of use. We
Hmm.
came from architectural background, so we technically do a lot of renderings. So we have used a lot of rendering programs, coming from like Enscape into Lumion and like Re-Ray. I think D5 comes in as the best part is the lighting, setting up the lightings and setting up the materials just because they have a basis like similar to Lumion. It helps it be quicker in some way to add entourage and other aspects in there. And it's a good balance between Rhino and D5, whether we're managing creating openings for the lighting or creating openings for the sync in terms of customization.
And just to add on that too, I think for me, the best aspect that I haven't seen in other rendering software, and I use many as well, D5 presets is really strong, and I haven't seen that in the other rendering software that I've used in the past. The idea of the whole studio and kind of creating your own preset and building off of default presets that D5 has is really powerful and saves you half of the time. Also, the use of the AI capability functions in D5 hand to hand with the presets just creates a very quick workflow in achieving realistic renderings, within several or 2 hours or so. And that's kind of been a significant workflow for us to kind of push projects through at quick turnarounds.
Thank you both so much. Let me go ahead and open up the QR code for the free trial. So, all right, awesome. That wraps up our Q&A session. As promised, be sure to scan the QR code to receive your 14-day trial of D5 Render Pro and try out some of the techniques that were covered today. Again, I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you for joining this webinar. I know it's a Saturday, so especially grateful for all of you to join. And again, a special thank you to our hosts, Kamar and Francis. Seriously, there were some real gems in there that I might just have to start incorporating into my own workflow. So once again, thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Saturday. Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Bye.